In the late 17th century, the Kingdom of Scotland was a nation on the brink of extinction. It was an ancient land with a proud history of independence, having fought off English invasions for centuries. But by the 1690s, swords and shields were no longer enough to secure a nation's survival. The world had changed. Power was no longer measured in acres of land or the number of soldiers you could field. It was measured in gold, in trade, and in the balance sheets of merchant companies. And by these new measures, Scotland was dying. To understand why a nation would gamble its entire existence on a single, desperate bet, we have to understand the depth of the despair that gripped Scotland in this decade. It was a time known in history as the 7 Ill Years. It began in 1695. The climate of Europe shifted. The winters became brutally long and cold. The summers were wet and gray. For 7 consecutive years, the harvests failed across Scotland. The result was a humanitarian catastrophe. In the countryside, thousands of people starved to death. Parishes that once supported thriving villages were reduced to ghost towns. There are reports from the time of people dropping dead in the streets of Edinburgh with grass in their mouths, having tried to graze like cattle just to fill their stomachs. It is estimated that up to 15% of the entire population died or fled the country during this period. The economy, which was almost entirely agricultural, collapsed, and there was no food to eat, and certainly no surplus food to sell. But the crisis wasn't just about the weather. It was about geopolitics. Scotland was trapped. To the south lay England, a powerhouse that was rapidly becoming the center of a global trading empire. The English had colonies in America, in the Caribbean, and trading posts in India. They had the Navigation Acts, laws which strictly forbade Scottish ships from trading with English colonies. If a Scottish merchant wanted to sell linen in Jamaica or buy tobacco in Virginia, he couldn't. He was locked out of the most lucrative markets in the world by his neighbor. Scotland was poor, isolated, and starving. The nation faced a stark choice: either accept a slow, lingering death as a backwater province, or find a way to break out. They needed a miracle. They needed a game changer. And into this atmosphere of desperation stepped a man who promised them the world. His name was William Paterson. He was a Scot, born in Dumfriesshire, but he had spent his life traveling the world. He was a merchant, a financier, and a man of immense charisma. He had made a fortune in London and had been instrumental in founding the Bank of England in 1694. He understood the new world of finance better than almost anyone alive. But Paterson was also a dreamer and perhaps a bit of a con artist. Paterson returned to Scotland with a vision that was breathtaking in its ambition. He told the Scottish people that they didn't need to compete with the English or the Dutch on their terms. They could leapfrog them. He pointed to a map of the world, to a narrow strip of land in Central America that connected the 2 great continents of North and South America, the Isthmus of Darien. We know it today as Panama. Paterson's pitch was intoxicatingly simple. He called Darien the door of the seas and the key to the universe. He argued that if Scotland could establish a colony there, they could build a port on the Atlantic side and a port on the Pacific side. They could transport goods across the narrow land bridge, a journey of only a few days, and cut out the long, dangerous, and expensive voyage around the tip of South America. Whoever controlled this choke point, Paterson argued, would control the trade between East and West. They would hold the keys to the treasure chests of China and the Indies. The merchants of the world would have to pay a toll to Scotland. It would make Scotland not just rich, but the richest nation on earth. It would be the trade hub of the globe. Paterson described the land of Darien as an Eden. He claimed the soil was so fertile it could yield 3 harvests a year without effort. He said the hills were full of gold and minerals. He said the natives were friendly and eager to trade. He painted a picture of a tropical paradise where wealth could be plucked from the trees. Crucially, he claimed that no European power claimed this land, meaning it was free for the taking. This was a lie. The Spanish Empire considered all of Central America to be their sovereign territory, but nobody in Scotland checked the map that closely. They were too hungry for hope. The Scottish Parliament was mesmerized. In 1695, they passed an act establishing the Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies. It was modeled on the East India Company of London, but it was to be a purely Scottish enterprise. The company was given sweeping powers. It could raise an army, build forts, sign treaties, and grant exemptions from all taxes for 20 years. It was essentially a sovereign state wrapped inside a corporation. Now came the hard part, raising the money. Paterson calculated that he needed $400,000 sterling to launch the colony. In the 1690s, this was an astronomical sum. At first, Paterson tried to raise the funds in London. The initial response was enthusiastic. English investors knew a good opportunity when they saw one. But the English government, pressured by the powerful East India Company, which feared the competition, stepped in. The king, William III, who was king of both England and Scotland, ordered the English investors to withdraw. He didn't want his Scottish subjects irritating the Spanish and dragging England into a war. The English investors pulled out. Scotland was on its own. This rejection by England transformed the project from a business venture into a national crusade. It became a matter of patriotism. The Scots were furious. They felt the English were trying to keep them poor. A wave of nationalist fervor swept the country. The subscription books were opened in Edinburgh in February 1696, and the response was hysterical. Every layer of Scottish society emptied their pockets. This wasn't just for the rich. Dukes and earls mortgaged their vast estates to buy shares for thousands of pounds. Merchants liquidated their stock. But it went deeper. Lawyers, doctors, professors, and priests bought in. Shopkeepers scraped together their life savings. Widows handed over their husbands' pensions. Even servants pooled their wages to buy a fraction of a share. It was a financial mania. People weren't just buying stock, they were buying salvation. They believed Paterson's promise that this colony would end the famine, restore the nation's pride, and make them all wealthy. With the capital secured, the company began to prepare. They bought ships from Amsterdam and Hamburg because Scotland didn't have a shipyard capable of building ocean-going vessels. They stockpiled supplies. They recruited settlers. 1,200 people were chosen for the first expedition. They were the cream of the crop. There were soldiers, officers, ministers, doctors, and sons of the gentry. There were also planters, ordinary men and women hoping for a new life. They were all promised land and freedom in the New World. But there was a fatal flaw in the preparations, one that revealed just how little the Scots understood about the world they were entering. They had to bring goods to trade with the indigenous people of Darien to make a profit. So what did they pack? They packed what they knew. They loaded the ships with thousands of heavy woolen blankets and coats, perfect for a Scottish winter, but useless in a tropical jungle. They packed thousands of pairs of heavy leather shoes. They packed wigs and Bibles, and most famously, they packed over 4,000 combs. They assumed the savages of Panama would be desperate for Scottish grooming products. They packed almost no food seeds suitable for the tropics, and very few tools for clearing dense jungle. On July 12, 1698, the fleet of 5 ships, the St. Andrew, the Caledonia, the Unicorn, the Dolphin, and the Endeavour, assembled at the port of Leith. The entire city of Edinburgh turned out to watch them go. It was a festival atmosphere. People cheered, wept, and waved flags. Ministers blessed the ships. They called them the Argonauts of the North. As the ships raised their anchors and sailed out into the North Sea, carrying the hopes and the fortune of an entire nation, nobody on the docks knew that they were sailing into a death trap. Nobody knew that William Paterson, the man who had sold them this dream, had never actually been to Darien. He had based his entire pitch on old pirate maps and rumors. He didn't know about the mosquitoes. He didn't know about the mangrove swamps. And he didn't know that the Spanish Empire was already watching, waiting for them to arrive. The voyage itself was a nightmare. The Scots were not experienced blue water sailors. The ships were overcrowded and poorly ventilated. The food, much of which was poorly preserved, began to rot in the barrels. Water turned green with algae. Dysentery and fever broke out below decks. By the time the fleet reached the Caribbean, 40 people had already died and were buried at sea. But the survivors remained optimistic. They believed the hard part was over. They believed they were arriving in paradise. On November 2nd, 1698, the lookout on the flagship St. Andrew spotted land. It was the coast of Darien. The ships navigated into a natural harbor that Paterson named Caledonia Bay. The settlers crowded the rails, staring at the thick green wall of jungle that came right down to the water's edge. They lowered the boats and rowed ashore. They planted the flag of Scotland in the sand. They claimed the land for the company and for the king. They started to unload the wool and the combs and the Bibles. They began to dig the foundations for their capital city, New Edinburgh, and a defensive fortification they named Fort St. Andrew. In their letters home, written in those first few weeks, they described the land as beautiful and promising. They talked about the abundance of fruit and the kindness of the local Kuna people. They sent these letters back on passing ships, fueling the mania back in Edinburgh. But the letters took months to arrive, and by the time the Scottish public was reading these glowing reports and celebrating the success of the colony, the reality on the ground in Panama had turned into a hell on earth. The dream was dissolving in the rain, and the investment of a nation was rotting in the mud. The tragedy of Darien had begun. The reality of Darien hit the settlers the moment they tried to unload the ships. William Paterson had promised them a deep, sheltered natural harbor where the merchant fleets of the world could anchor safely. What they found was a treacherous, shallow bay, guarded by submerged rocks and plagued by fierce currents. To get the heavy crates of merchandise ashore, the men had to stand waist-deep in the surf for hours, passing goods hand to hand under the blistering equatorial sun. The site chosen for New Edinburgh was even worse. Paterson had pointed to a spot on the map that looked like a defensible peninsula. In reality, it was a narrow spit of land surrounded by brackish, stagnant water. It wasn't a paradise. It was a mosquito breeding ground. But the Scots were stubborn. They were there to build an empire, and they set to work with a manic energy. They felled the dense mahogany trees to build huts. They dragged cannons up the muddy slopes to fortify Fort St. Andrew. They began to dig yams and plant the few seeds that hadn't rotted in the ship's holds. For the first few weeks, adrenaline and national pride kept them going. They sent hunting parties into the jungle who returned with strange fruits and exotic birds. They believed that if they just worked hard enough, they could tame this wilderness. But an economy cannot run on hard work alone. It needs a market. And this was the first catastrophic failure of the Scottish plan. The settlers opened their crates to trade with the local Kuna people. The Kuna were friendly and curious. They approached the strange pale men to see what they had brought. The Scots proudly displayed their wares: heavy woolen blankets woven in the highlands, thick linen stockings, leather brogues, and thousands of lice combs. The Kuna looked at these heavy, itchy fabrics in the stifling tropical heat and were baffled. They had no use for wool in a jungle where the temperature rarely dropped below 80 degrees. They didn't wear heavy shoes. They didn't need wigs. The Scots tried to explain the value of the goods, but the economics of supply and demand are universal. There was zero demand. The Kuna offered some fruit and plantains in exchange for trinkets, but they had no gold to give, and they certainly didn't have the spices or silk that Paterson had promised. The trade mission, the entire economic engine of the colony, stalled on day one. Then came the second blow, which was deliberate economic warfare. The Scottish colony relied on the idea that English merchant ships from Jamaica and the American colonies would stop by to trade food and supplies. The Scots assumed that profit would override politics. They were wrong. King William III was furious about the Darien Scheme. He saw it as a threat to his relationship with Spain. He decided to strangle the Scottish colony financially. He issued a royal proclamation to all the English governors in the Caribbean and North America. It was brutal in its clarity. No English subject was allowed to offer any assistance to the Scots at Darien. They were forbidden to sell them food, forbidden to lend them money, and forbidden to buy their goods. The colony was placed under a total economic blockade by its own king. Ships from Jamaica that passed within sight of New Edinburgh refused to stop. The Scots watched from the beach as their potential lifelines sailed right past them. They were isolated. They had money. The company had sent chests of silver and credit notes. But money is useless if no one will sell you anything. They were the richest people in the jungle, and they were starving. By early 1699, the 7 ill years of Scotland had followed them to Panama. The rainy season began. It didn't just rain. The sky opened up and drowned the colony. The huts, built with green wood and thatched with palm leaves, leaked constantly. The ground turned into a slurry of mud and excrement. The provisions they had brought from Scotland, the barrels of flour and salted beef, began to rot in the humidity. The bread turned into a green paste. The meat crawled with maggots. And then the flux arrived. Dysentery and yellow fever swept through New Edinburgh like a wildfire. The mosquito-infested swamp that Paterson had chosen was a biological weapon. Men would wake up in the morning with a fever and be dead by sunset. The doctors had no quinine, no effective medicine. They bled the patients, which only killed them faster. The death rate soared. At the height of the epidemic, 12 settlers were dying every single day. The living were too weak to bury the dead. They dug shallow mass graves in the mud, but the heavy rains would wash the soil away, exposing the bodies. The stench of death hung over the colony, mixing with the smell of rotting vegetation. William Paterson, the architect of this disaster, watched his dream collapse. His own wife was one of the first to die. He fell ill himself, drifting in and out of a coma, helpless to stop the unraveling of his plan. Discipline broke down. The 4 counselors appointed to lead the colony argued constantly. One of them turned out to be a spy for the Spanish. Another was a drunkard who hoarded the remaining alcohol. The soldiers began to steal food from the sick. There was talk of mutiny. By June 1699, only 7 months after they arrived, the colony was broken. 400 settlers, 1/3 of the original expedition, were dead. The rest were walking skeletons. They had not traded a single cargo. They had not established a route to the Pacific. They were eating boiled leather and wild roots. They held a final council meeting. The decision was unanimous: abandonment. They dragged themselves onto the 4 remaining ships. They were so weak they couldn't even weigh the anchors. They had to cut the cables and leave the expensive iron anchors in the mud. On June 22, 1699, the fleet limped out of Caledonia Bay, leaving behind the empty huts and the graveyard of their ambitions. The voyage home was a horror story that eclipsed even the suffering in the colony. The ships were floating hospitals. They were battered by storms. The St. Andrew made it to Jamaica, but the crew was so sick they couldn't work the sails. The English governor, obeying the king's orders, refused to let them buy fresh water or food. He let them die in the harbor. The Unicorn sailed north to New York, but it was leaking so badly it had to be abandoned on the shore of New Jersey. Of the 100 proud Scots who had left Leith with flags flying, fewer than 300 survived the return journey. Most were buried at sea, wrapped in the woolen blankets they had hoped to sell. But the tragedy of Darien wasn't just that it failed. It was that the communication was so slow, the disaster happened twice. While the survivors were dying in the jungle, back in Edinburgh, The company directors were starved for news. They spun rumors into facts. They told the public that the colony was thriving, that the Spanish had surrendered, that gold had been found. The stock price of the company soared. Based on these lies, the directors organized a second expedition. They raised more money from the desperate population. They refitted more ships. In August 1699, 2 months after the first colony had already been abandoned, the second fleet set sail from Scotland. The second expedition consisted of 4 ships and 1,300 new settlers. They carried more wool, more Bibles, and more combs. They sailed with high hearts, believing they were going to reinforce a booming commercial hub. They brought with them the last remaining capital of the Scottish nation. The voyage was long and hard. They arrived in Caledonia Bay on November 30th, 1699. They sailed into the harbor expecting to see smoke rising from chimneys and to hear the bagpipes playing from the fort. Instead, they found silence. They rowed ashore and found a ghost town. The huts were burned. The fort was overgrown with vines. The tools lay rusting in the mud. And everywhere there were graves. The shock was absolute. The leaders of the second expedition stood in the ruins of New Edinburgh and realized the terrible truth. They had been sent to a graveyard. The money was gone. The dream was a lie. Some of the captains wanted to turn around immediately and sail back to Scotland. But the winds were against them, and they had barely enough food to survive the return trip. They were trapped. Grimly, they decided to stay. They tried to rebuild the huts, but the psychological weight of living in the ruins of the first expedition crushed them. They could see the skeletons of their countrymen poking out of the shallow graves. They knew that the flux was still in the soil. And this time, the Spanish Empire wasn't going to wait. The Spanish viceroy in Mexico City had heard about the Scottish invasion. He had mobilized a fleet. He gathered an army of professional soldiers. He was determined to wipe the Scots off the map once and for all. In February 1700, 3 months after the second fleet arrived, the Spanish Armada appeared on the horizon. 11 warships. They blockaded the mouth of the harbor, trapping the Scottish ships inside. Simultaneously, a Spanish army marched through the jungle and surrounded the fort. The Scots were now fighting a war on 3 fronts. Against the Spanish, against the disease, and against starvation. They were outnumbered and outgunned. The Spanish cannons pounded the flimsy wooden defenses of Fort St. Andrew. The wells inside the fort ran dry. For a month, the Scots held out. It was a brave, futile stand. They were fighting for a colony that was already dead, for a company that was already bankrupt. Finally, in March 1700, the Scottish commander signaled for a parley. He surrendered. The Spanish general was surprisingly merciful. He admired the Scots' courage in such hopeless conditions. He allowed them to board their ships and leave with their flags flying, provided they swore never to return to the Spanish Main. The final evacuation began. The Scots loaded their sick and wounded onto the ships. They sailed out of the bay, past the Spanish warships. They left behind the graves of 2,000 of their countrymen. They left behind the dream of a Scottish empire. As the ships disappeared over the horizon, the Spanish burned New Edinburgh to the ground. The jungle reclaimed the land. Within a few years, there was no trace that the Scots had ever been there. But while the physical colony was gone, the financial shockwave was just beginning to travel across the Atlantic. It was a tsunami of debt that was about to hit the shores of Scotland. When the news of the total abandonment and the surrender to the Spanish finally reached Edinburgh, the wailing could be heard in the streets. The nation woke up to a balance sheet that was bleeding red ink. The Company of Scotland was insolvent. The ships were lost. The cargo was lost. The capital was lost. There was no insurance. There was no backup plan. Scotland had bet the house, and the house had won. The nation was now effectively a pauper in the court of Europe. And, in London, the English parliamentarians watched the collapse with cold satisfaction. They knew that the time for negotiation was over. The time for acquisition had arrived. Scotland was up for sale. The news of the final surrender at Darien did not arrive in Scotland all at once. It arrived in fragments, carried by rumors and passing merchant ships. But by the spring of 1700, the full, undeniable weight of the catastrophe had landed on the docks of Leith. The impossible had happened. The colony was gone. The ships were gone. And most terrifying of all, the money was gone. To understand the panic that gripped Scotland in 1700, you have to remember the scale of the investment. This wasn't just a stock market crash where rich men lost their surplus wealth. This was a national liquidation. The immediate economic impact was a total freeze. There was no cash left in circulation to pay for anything. Merchants couldn't pay their suppliers. Landowners couldn't pay their debts. Tenants couldn't pay their rents. The entire machinery of the Scottish economy ground to a halt because the lubricant, gold and silver coin, had been drained away. The Company of Scotland, which was supposed to be the engine of a new empire, was now a rotting corpse. Its stock, which people had fought to buy just 2 years earlier, was worthless. Men who had been wealthy and respected citizens suddenly found themselves destitute. Estates that had been in families for generations were put up for sale, but there were no buyers, because there was no money to buy them with. A deep, dark depression settled over the land. The 7 ill years of famine had weakened the population physically, but the Darien disaster broke them psychologically. They had tried to play the game of empires, and they had been crushed. Denial quickly turned to rage. The Scottish people refused to believe that the failure was due to their own incompetence or the poor planning of William Paterson. They looked for a scapegoat, and they found one in London. The anger was directed squarely at King William III and the English Parliament. The narrative in the streets of Edinburgh was that Darien hadn't failed. It had been murdered. It had been strangled by the English blockade, sabotaged by English spies, and abandoned by a king who cared more for his Dutch and English subjects than his Scottish ones. Riots broke out in Edinburgh. Mobs smashed the windows of government officials known to be sympathetic to England. They burned effigies of English ministers. The mood was ugly, violent, and bordering on revolutionary. This rage culminated in one of the most infamous incidents of the era, the Worcester Affair. In 1704, an English merchant ship, the Worcester, sought shelter in the Firth of Forth. The Scots, hungry for revenge, seized the ship. They accused the English captain, Thomas Green, and his crew of piracy. They claimed, without any real evidence, that Green had sunk one of the missing Darien ships and murdered its Scottish crew. It was a show trial driven by bloodlust. The mob demanded justice for Darien. Captain Green and 2 of his officers were found guilty and sentenced to death. Despite pleas from London and the lack of proof, the Scottish authorities were too afraid of the Edinburgh mob to grant a pardon. On April 11th, 1705, Captain Green was dragged to Leith Sands and hanged before a cheering crowd of thousands. It was a grim spectacle. It felt like revenge, but hanging 3 Englishmen didn't bring the money back. It didn't fill the empty treasury. It didn't put food on the table. While the mob screamed for blood, the Scottish elite, the nobles and the powerful merchants, were quietly doing the math. They were the ones running the Parliament in Edinburgh, and they knew the situation was terminal. They looked at the balance sheet of the nation. Scotland had a massive trade deficit. They were importing manufactured goods from England and Europe, but they had nothing to export to pay for them. Their wool was too coarse, their linen industry was undeveloped, and their cattle trade was precarious. Without the Darien colony to generate new wealth, Scotland was on a path to becoming a failed state. The government couldn't even pay the army. The soldiers were unpaid and mutinous. The civil servants hadn't received wages in months. The state was effectively insolvent. In London, the new monarch, Queen Anne, and her advisors watched the chaos in the north with deep concern. They didn't care about Scottish poverty, but they cared about security. England was at war with France, and a bankrupt, angry Scotland was a dangerous backdoor. They feared the Scots might ally with the French or try to restore the exiled Stuart kings to the throne just to spite England. The English decided it was time to solve the Scottish problem once and for all. They wanted a political union. They wanted to dissolve the Scottish Parliament and create a single united kingdom. But the Scots were proud. They hated the idea of being swallowed by their historic enemy. They passed the Act of Security, declaring that they reserved the right to choose a different monarch than England and to pursue their own foreign policy. It was a declaration of independence. England responded with a hammer. In 1705, the English Parliament passed the Alien Act. It was a piece of economic blackmail. It stated that unless Scotland agreed to negotiate for a union, all trade between the 2 countries would be banned. Scottish cattle, linen, and coal would be barred from English markets. Furthermore, all Scots living in England would be treated as aliens, stripped of their rights and property. It was a death sentence. England was Scotland's biggest market. If the border closed, the Scottish economy wouldn't just suffer, it would collapse completely into medieval subsistence. The Alien Act forced the Scottish leadership to the table. They realized they had no leverage. They were bankrupt, starving, and now facing a total economic blockade. The negotiations for the Treaty of Union began in London in 1706. The Scottish commissioners were chosen from the nobility, the very men who had lost the most money in the Darien Scheme. The English negotiators were clever. They knew that to get the Union passed, they didn't need to convince the Scottish people. They only needed to convince the Scottish Parliament, and they knew exactly what those parliamentarians wanted. They wanted their money back. So, the English put a number on the table, 398,080 fambers and 10 shillings. They called it the equivalent. The official explanation was that this sum was compensation for Scotland taking on a share of England's national debt. But everyone in the room knew what it really was. It was almost exactly the amount of money lost in the Darien disaster, plus 5% interest. It was a bailout. England was essentially saying, we will reimburse you for every penny you lost in Panama. We will make you whole. We will save you from bankruptcy. But the price is your country. You must sign away your sovereignty. The Scottish commissioners looked at the offer. It was a lifeline. It meant they wouldn't be ruined. It meant they could pay their debts. It meant the nation's liquidity would be restored. They accepted the terms. When the commissioners returned to Edinburgh to present the treaty to the Scottish Parliament, the public reaction was explosive. The people saw the equivalent for what it was, a bribe. the streets of Edinburgh filled with protesters. They shouted that their leaders were selling the independence of Scotland, fought for by Wallace and Bruce, for a bag of English gold. They called the commissioners the parcel of rogues. Inside the Parliament, the debate raged. Patriotic speeches were made about liberty and history. Lord Belhaven gave a famous speech where he wept for the end of Mother Caledonia, but money talks louder than poetry. The Squadrone Volante, a group of influential nobles, held the balance of power. They had been heavily invested in Darien. The promise of the equivalent was too tempting. English agents moved quietly through Edinburgh, offering promises of pensions, jobs, and direct cash payments to secure the votes. The vote was scheduled for January 1707. The city was under martial law. Soldiers lined the Royal Mile to protect the parliamentarians from their own people. The atmosphere was tense, suffocating, and filled with the sense of an ending. The Scottish ruling class had to make a choice between poverty with independence or prosperity with union. They looked at their ruined estates. They looked at the memory of the starving settlers in Darien. And they looked at the promise of English gold. In the end, the ghost of Darien cast the deciding vote. The disaster had stripped the nation of its confidence and its capital. The gamble in the jungle had failed, and now the bill was due. The only way to pay it was to sell the house. On January 16, 1707, inside the Parliament Hall in Edinburgh, the final vote was cast. The Treaty of Union was ratified by 110 votes to 69. The deed was done. The Chancellor of Scotland, Lord Seafield, signed the document and famously muttered, "Now there's an end to an auld sang." The Kingdom of Scotland, which had existed as an independent sovereign state for over 800 years, was legally dissolved. On May 1st, 1707, the new United Kingdom of Great Britain came into existence. The Scottish Parliament was adjourned, and its members packed their bags to travel south to Westminster and London. But while the politicians had signed the paper, the reality of the transaction was about to arrive on the back of a wagon train. In August 1707, the equivalent arrived in Edinburgh. It was a caravan of 12 wagons, heavily guarded by Scottish dragoons. The procession made its way up the Royal Mile to Edinburgh Castle, but there were no cheers. As the wagons rolled past, the crowd stood in sullen silence. Then the shouting started. People screamed curses at the soldiers. Stones were thrown. The mob saw the gold not as salvation, but as the price of their betrayal. It was Judas money. The money was deposited in the castle, and the distribution began. The process was messy and bureaucratic, but slowly the cash flowed out. The investors in the Company of Scotland presented their worthless stock certificates and received English gold in return. The immediate effect was a stabilization of the Scottish economy. The liquidity crisis was over. Debts were paid. The threat of national bankruptcy receded. The noble families who had been on the brink of ruin were saved. But the equivalent was more than just a refund. It was the seed capital for the future of Scotland. Some of the money was used to pay off the company's debts. But a significant portion, about $30,000, was set aside for investment in Scottish industries like wool, fishing, and linen. Even more importantly, the machinery of the buyout created a new institution. The group of men appointed to manage the distribution of the equivalent money eventually reorganized themselves. In 1727, they formed a new bank to lend this capital out to Scottish businesses. They called it the Royal Bank of Scotland. This was the supreme irony of the Darien disaster. The failed scheme to build a global empire in Panama had bankrupted the nation. But the bailout money from that failure founded the bank that would eventually help finance the British Empire. For the next generation of Scots, the Union was a bitter pill. The immediate economic boom that the pro-Unionists had promised didn't happen overnight. English taxes were introduced, which were higher and more rigorously enforced. The Scottish linen industry struggled to compete with English wool. There were Jacobite rebellions in 1715 and 1745, fueled in part by the lingering resentment against the Union and the sense of national humiliation. But slowly, over decades, the logic of the Union began to take hold. The Alien Act threat was gone. The Navigation Acts were lifted. Scottish merchants were no longer locked out of the world. They now had legal access to the English colonies in America and the Caribbean. The Scots, who had failed so spectacularly to build their own colony in Darien, proved to be geniuses at running other people's colonies. They flooded into the British Empire. Glasgow transformed from a small town into a global hub of the tobacco trade. Scottish soldiers became the backbone of the British Army. Scottish engineers, doctors, and administrators spread across India, Canada, and Australia. By the late 18th century, Scotland was experiencing the Scottish Enlightenment. It became a powerhouse of intellect and industry. Edinburgh was called the Athens of the North. The poverty and starvation of the 1690s were a distant memory, but the scar of Darien remained. It was the trauma that birthed modern Scotland. It taught the nation a brutal lesson about the relationship between economics and sovereignty. The Darien Scheme was a gamble, born of desperation. Scotland tried to become a world power overnight by betting everything on a map drawn by a dreamer. they ignored the realities of geography, biology, and geopolitics. They forgot that ambition requires capital, and that a small nation with no navy cannot bully an empire like Spain. The collapse of the scheme proved that, in the modern world, financial independence is the only true independence. When Scotland lost its money, it lost its ability to say no. Today, if you travel to the remote coast of Panama, to the place the Scots called Caledonia Bay, there is almost nothing left. The jungle has swallowed New Edinburgh. The fort is a mound of earth under the trees. The graves of the 2,000 settlers are lost in the undergrowth. But if you look at a map of the world, or look at the history of the British Empire, or look at the Royal Bank of Scotland, you see the legacy of those lost settlers. Their failure was the catalyst that ended a kingdom and created an empire. Scotland died in the jungles of Panama so that Britain could be born. It was the most expensive bad investment in history, and the receipt for the transaction was the Act of Union. The dream of Darien was a folly, but its consequences reshaped the world. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.